Figuring out, oh, Polycarp was after Paul, who was after this. That will come later, but you want to capture your kids by the stories. In his book, A Children's History of the World by V.M. Hillier, when asked the question, why should we even teach children history, things of the past, this is what he says. He says, to give the children some idea of what has gone on in the world before he arrived, to take him out of his little self-centered, shut-in life, which looms so large because it's so close to his eyes, to extend his horizon, broaden his view, and open up the vista down the ages past, to acquaint him with some of the big events and great names, and fix these in time and space as a basis for detailed study in the future, to give him a chronological file with main guides into which he can fit in its proper place all his further historical study.
Okay, maybe we should close because I don't think I can put it any better. That was so eloquent.
I know.
I never would ever use the word vista in a sentence. Mm-hmm. And now that's my goal in life. I'm going to use vista in a sentence before I die.
Oh, I love that quote. And I thought of it immediately when we were talking about doing the topic that we are covering today, because it's a good reminder of why teaching our children things in the past is so vital to their development as believers in Christ, as people who know God, know what God has done, what he is doing, and what he is going to do. So
yeah, maybe we could put in the show notes, Micah, you could put that quote in the show notes, because that quote is so good. It's just a concise but thorough reason for why we should teach our kids church history. Because I don't know, maybe someone saw the title of this one and thought, that one's not that interesting, or I have no idea how I'm going to teach my kids church history.
Yes,
or even why should we teach our kids church history? And that beautifully captures the why.
Yeah. And his book, A Children's History of the World, is such a wonderful book. And I think what you're talking about, you use the word history, and that brings up all kinds of stuff for people. But
brings up a lot of baggage for people listening right now. They hear history.
Yes.
They think they're history classes in high school or middle school, which, let me just say, if that's where your mind goes, if that's where your feelings go, we want to free you from that. We agree that typically in our educational institutions, the way we teach history through a textbook ruins history for most of us.
Yeah.
Okay? So we want to validate your feelings if you have negative feelings towards history,
and correct your view of what history really is. And especially as Christians, we know history is his story. It's God's story of what he's done. It's the story through the ages of all
clever.
The people.
Story. His story.
Actually, I got
History.
that from V.M. Hillier, who I quoted.
Did he come up with that
talking
idea?
About
his story, history.
I'm not sure, but that's how he opens his book. And oftentimes we've had it in textbooks, or which has also been said is like reading a textbook is like chewing on sawdust.
That's a good quote.
And so when we've had it bore us, then we can have a negative feeling towards history. But what we're talking about particularly today is the history of the church. And it's appropriate that we're talking about it today because today is June 29th. And June 29th is the day of the Christian Martyr in the Christian church. Some of you may not be familiar with that if you don't go to a church that really looks at the church calendar and celebrates some of these holidays.
Go back to our podcast. It was probably a month and a half ago that we did the podcast on church history? Do you remember that one, Erin?
No,
Because I
I'm
know
not on
as
church history.
now
No.
that you're in middle age, your memory fails you often.
We did it on the church calendar, you mean?
I mean, that's what I didn't. That's
No,
not
you
what I
said church history.
Yeah, I meant church calendar.
Oh.
For those who didn't listen to the church calendar podcast, go listen to that because it'll make sense of why there is a Day of the Christian Martyr.
Mm-hmm. Which in talking about the church calendar, we talked about this idea of tethering our kids to a big church, not just a small, the church
universal.
Yes, is not just a small church in the town we live in, but is actually big all around the world and from the beginning of time of human history. Okay, so we thought today is the perfect day to talk about the importance of studying church history and how to do it with your kids. Do not buy a textbook. We will not suggest that. But we are going to point this episode, I'm hoping we can get through. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see all the resources we have on our kitchen table right here. So we have a lot of resources to point you to. And hopefully some of these will help you as you start on this important endeavor of teaching your kids some church history.
But before we get into the how, we want to talk about the why because we want to motivate you to do this. Mm-hmm. We want to encourage parents out there to make this part of their discipleship with their kids. Mm-hmm. And the earlier you start this, the easier it is. Okay, so some of you, maybe you just have like middle schoolers and high schoolers in your home, and you're thinking, yeah, right, I'm going to somehow now get my middle schooler, high schooler interested in church history. Well, that's going to be a more difficult task if they have had no training in it, if we haven't kind of helped them develop an appetite for it. But of course, it's never too late.
Yes.
So don't give up hope. There might be some things that we could do and we'll recommend.
Yeah.
But early on, you start with them at 2, 3, 4, you're going to be able to build a culture in your family that values church history. But why should you do that? Well, we want to list out a number of reasons why it's important to study church history. So, Erin, why is it important to study church history? We're going to start with your reasons.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think because you don't want to just, you want to put all things in the biblical worldview in this big picture of God and his story, what he's doing. And so I think as we teach them stories of people who have followed God and done different things, overcome persecution, been martyred for their faith, it tethers them to this big story of what God's doing. And like Greg Kokel talks about this, our friend, in The Story of Reality, and teaching and knowing this big story and its beginning in Genesis 1, God created the heavens and the earth. And so God created all these things. Then the second part, sin came into the world, Genesis 3. Then God provided a redeemer in Jesus Christ. And then now we are in the time of restoration. And we know the end of the story and what's going to happen. And of course, that's in the book of Revelation of the new heavens, the new earth. And so,
there's a good resource. There's a good book recently that came out on culture that talks about those four chapters of history.
I was about to say, oh, what new book that just came out?
Well, everyone should be aware of this, but it's called A Practical Guide to Culture by Brett Kunkel and John Stonestreet.
Yes.
But and that's not unique to us, that kind of creation, fall, redemption, restoration kind of is the 4 big, broad sweeps of Christian history, of the world history is not unique to us, but it's a very helpful way of kind of characterizing it for our kids and remembering. And it also helps you to see the I guess the classical elements of a good story. the origin, right? In any good story, there's a kind of an origin part of it where they're telling the history of where this character came from and what has shaped him or her and where they're, about to go. And then second chapter, conflict, right? That's the fall. The conflict. There's some big conflict now that creates chaos, that breaks the situation and now needs to be solved. And chapter 3, redemption in the Christian story. The hero comes and saves the day. And in the same way, in a good story, the hero comes or the heroine comes and kind of brings, resolution to the conflict. And then that fourth chapter is happily ever after, the restoration of all things. There's a happy ending.
And we're in the happily ever after, not yet part. We're in the, like you think about the happily, I think of Revelation, Christ's return is the happily ever
That's
after.
the restoration of all things.
Right. So
we're not in that fourth chapter yet.
Right. So we're in this time right now where we are again waiting for Christ to come back. But we are called to bring about restoration where we can in our time and in our place.
Yeah. His first coming, he inaugurates the kingdom, and that's the already, right? The kingdom of God is at hand. And yet there is a second coming where that's the not yet.
Yeah.
And that's the happily ever after is coming. And but that work has already started in this chapter. So that's just a helpful way to lay out the larger framework of God's story for our younger kids in particular to memorize that, for older kids to memorize that, as a way to really even understand Scripture, right? This helps you understand the big picture of Scripture, to see the forest from the trees.
Yeah, and it roots us and our kids in this bigger picture, which helps us sometimes pull out of our momentary trials and struggles, or thinking like, wow, this world is a mess and there's no hope. It roots our hope in something much different, much deeper than just this time and this place and this moment, or whatever is happening culturally, politically, in our communities, in our families, whatever. So
yeah, it gives us a kind of a place, or it helps us to understand our place in the story.
Yeah.
Right. And you think about what Paul says when he's in Athens on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. In fact, I'll read that one because I think this is one reason it's important to study church history. He says in Acts 17, in the second half of verse 25, he talks about God, he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. So our origin is God. And this is what he's saying to the folks in Athens. And then he says this in verse 26 of Acts 17. And God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Then he says this, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Okay, so there you have scripture that affirms that God has placed us in his sovereignty in these times. And so, like you were saying, we might find these to be challenging times. But there is a comfort and a confidence that comes when we understand, well, God has called you to this time. This is where God has placed us in his sovereign plan, and to help our kids see that. Like there's a lot of challenges, but this is where we are called to. This is where God has placed us. And so it helps us to see that we're called to this moment in the history of the church. No, we're not living in the first century. We're living in the 21st century, and God has us here for the work of his kingdom at this time. And so that larger framework helps to kind of place us where we should be placed, and then to have confidence, yeah, this is no accident.
Yeah.
And I think it helps, and all of that helps to reveal God's sovereignty. And this is another reason why we study church history, because it reveals the nature of God. It reveals that we serve a sovereign creator who has not only made all things, But I mean, elsewhere in Acts 17, Paul talks about how in him we move and live and have our being. And so he is sustaining us. He has us in this moment according to his sovereign purposes.
And so that we don't just focus on self too. This is why history, I mean, there's so many benefits and we're going to go through those, but looking back and seeing how God had other people, other Christians in their time, in their place, and what he did through them. And that gives us this perspective that we need in this big story. God's moving. He's still moving today. He called other people, other Christians at other times. And so, we're here today. What could he be calling us to do in our time and our place? Mm-hmm. So if it's done well, if you teach church history well, it attaches your children and yourself. I'll speak for myself. It attaches you to the church, the ancient church of long ago, and even not so ancient, maybe 200 years ago or whenever it is. But it attaches you to your brothers and sisters in Christ from long ago, and you feel like you're shoulder to shoulder with them. I like Corrie ten Boom talks about, and she's one we'll mention today, but she talks about in her home growing up, there was this idea that we are in Jesus's army. And so it does give you that feeling of, we're in this army of people who are living for Christ. And of course, studying their stories broadens your imagination of what that looks like in different times, different places.
Well, yeah, and that touches on one of the benefits that we've kind of listed here. It's encouraging. You're encouraged because you see, hey, I'm not the only Christian who's struggled. Mm-hmm. Or I'm not the only Christian, or we're not the only Christians who have faced difficult times. In fact, it helps put our quote unquote difficult times into a proper light. Mm-hmm. Like actually, in the history of 2,000 years of church history, we right now in the U.S. probably have it better than 99% of the Christians that have gone before us. So it gives you a helpful perspective, but it can encourage you. Mm-hmm. It can encourage you that other Christians have faced this stuff and made it through.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about, like you brought up, if we haven't done this before and we have older kids in our home. And so the thought of like, I don't think I could start this. Why would I start it? To start to show your teenagers Christians from the past who have been redeemed, some of these amazing stories who have been redeemed and then fought the culture or their government or whatever in some kind of way, that can help to cast a vision for your teenagers of what we're asking them to do, which is to live quite differently than the culture.
Yeah.
And so, like, I'm thinking about the story of John Newton, like this wicked, terrible man, and who had, like he would say, just a heart of stone. He ran slave ships. God gets a hold of his life. He redeems him in a miraculous way, and then uses him eventually to bring about the abolition of slaves in Great Britain. It's a crazy story. And
now, if someone says, wait a second, that was William Wilberforce who did that. And without answering that, I'd say, this is why we need to study
don't tell
some
them the
church
answer.
history. No, don't let them off easy.
Okay, so you start to introduce your kids to people like this. And if you do it with good resources, a good story pulls people in.
Yeah.
And when you start to learn about these people, again, you feel like, I know him, I know her, and should appropriately cause us to feel like, hey, they're in our family. They're in our church family.
Yeah, so this is one of the other benefits. It provides flesh and blood pictures or models for us to imitate. Like, it's easy to say to our kids, you need to do this and you need to do this and you need to do this, right? Here are God's laws and we're supposed to obey it and this is the right thing to do. But man, it really helps strengthen us in doing that and giving us courage in doing what is right and standing up when people are against us by seeing models who have gone before us and done it. And then lastly, we'd say the study of church history can provide so many corrective benefits. Look, has the church ever struggled with theological error? Yeah, just study church history and you can see some of the battles, the very important battles, battling over essential doctrines, battling over the nature of God and the nature of Christ, going all the way back, to the Council of Nicaea. And that can help us today make sure we don't go into theological error, right? It can help us learn some of the lessons from the mistakes of the church. When we study church history, there are Christians who, as well-intentioned as they may have been, made some mistakes that we can look at and go, okay, that might help give us some wisdom here. It's corrective in that it helps us to understand we're not the center of the universe, right? And think about modern American evangelical Christianity that says, hey, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life, and just how that can really orient us to seeing faith as just for us. In fact, didn't you want to read the quote?
Well, yeah, every time this topic comes up, I think about C.S. Lewis, because he talked about this idea of chronological snobbery and so in an introduction that he wrote to Athanasius' book on the incarnation, Athanasius, speaking of some church history, history and the Council at Nicaea and all that you were just talking about. So Lewis wrote this introduction, and he's making a case for why we should read old books and basically why we should know history. But he says that it's so easy for us to make common assumptions, this idea that the ideas in our culture, we just assume them. So reading old things can help us to see this. And he says that none of us can fully escape the blindness of being in just our own time and place. We're blinded by things. And especially if we're only reading modern books or modern things. And so he says we should have the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And I love that picture of, like you said, these are phrases I want to get into my vocabulary, but the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, because people are no cleverer now than they were before. And he says they have made many mistakes in the past as we, but not the same mistakes. And so looking in the past, we can see, oh, wow, they made those mistakes. But then it helps us to see, oh, what mistakes are we making today? And you can't get that perspective just by staying in modern times.
There's that quote, like, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of the idea.
And because like what you said, I'm just thinking about, okay, so what are the cultural issues of this time? Well, we've talked about all of them on the podcast, but abortion,
gender ideology,
sexuality, race, cultures, all these things. Have Christians had to navigate these types of issues in cultures at different times? Yes, they have. Yeah. So the benefit of looking back in time, seeing what they were battling, seeing what the ideas were of that time, help us to see more clearly the lies of our own time and the truth. And it just gives us a clearer picture of that.
Yeah. So if you are not convinced by this point that you should be studying church history yourself or teaching your kids church history, I don't have anything else to say to you. I don't know what, I mean, we just laid out very powerful reasons.
So let's provide some easy ways to do this. Because if you're thinking, hey, I'm not a reader, I'm not going to pull out these old books on the history of the church from the year 1000 or something like that. So we want to shatter that bias that you may have and say, okay, we have some wonderful resources at our fingertips, which is part of the benefit of living in this time and place, is that books are easy to get, videos, watching things on over technology is easy for us to do. So I want to start with maybe
the Book of Acts. That's where church history begins.
Well, yeah, I was going to start with the littlest of kids, maybe, and then
start with age groups.
Go to resources as we get older, and then we'll include resources for parents.
Yeah,
for
we're
adults.
just going to try to get real practical here, and then show you some specific things that are out there. In fact, if you're listening to this podcast or watching the video on our YouTube channel, please, if you know of good resources out there on church history, please email those to us, send those to us.
Yeah.
Let us know so that we can expand the resources that we offer to people. Mm-hmm. So you can simply email us at info@maventruth.com. Or, I don't know, get on the social media posts for this podcast episode and list, more. Maybe we should put up a post on Facebook and say, hey, what are your resources for teaching church history to your kids? Yeah,
so because I'm sure I know there's more out there that we don't even know about. But let's start with, maybe like 3 to 8 year old type resources. So if you have young kids in your home,
3 to 8. Mm-hmm. 3 to 8
and
years
you want to
age.
start teaching them about people in the church who have gone before us. First I'll mention this book series. It's called Little Lights. And these are short books about different people in history. So there's one on Corrie ten Boom, who I've already mentioned.
This is the Corrie ten Boom one. Are All of the Watches Safe is the title of this one.
And so one of my favorite ones in this series is about Helen Roseveare. And
entitled, What's in the Parcel?
What's in the Parcel. And it tells the story of Helen, a single woman going to be a missionary in these orphanages, and this incredible story of God providing for her. And I don't want to give it away because it's such a great story.
It's an incredible, miraculous story. In fact, J.P. Moreland, who we had on talking about miracles a little while ago, in his new book, includes her story in his book on miracles. This is a well-documented miracle story.
Yeah, and it's just amazing. And so there's books on Hudson Taylor, George Mueller, and if you're saying, who are these people? Well, perfect. You can buy these books, read them with your kids, and you'll start to learn about some of these amazing Christians in history.
Here's one on
Eric Liddell.
Eric Liddell. Are You Ready? Of course, if you're familiar with that name, you're like, Eric Liddell, yeah, Chariots of Fire. Mm-hmm. And that actually makes me think, for the older kids, right? Chariots of Fire is a great resource. You're like, I can't read this one to my high schooler, right? But you can show Chariots of Fire and get some background on that story, and that's a way to get some of the older kids interested in some of
Eric
history.
Liddell's story is amazing, and then he ends up dying, getting arrested and dying in the concentration camps with the people he was sharing the gospel with.
So his story for the 3 to 8 year olds.
Yeah. So, these ones, speaking of Athanasius, I mentioned Athanasius. For parents, reading on the incarnation is good, but you're not going to read that to your kids, but you can learn the story of Athanasius there's a series called Christian Biographies for young readers. We have Athanasius, we have John Knox, we have Anselm of Canterbury. So these are great books too. They have really pretty illustrations.
Now these are definitely going to be for the older. These aren't going to be for the 3-year-olds.
No.
I'll just take I'll open it up here and show people kind of the text. These are going to be more your 6, 7, 8-year-olds.
Yeah.
Even older, do you think?
Yes. And these, I don't sit down and read it cover to cover with the kids. These are like, I'll read a little bit and then we'll read a little bit more later. And so you can take more time to go through the whole story.
Yeah.
And it has maps and all kinds of stuff. So they're seeing what part of the world these people are from. They include some historical pictures of buildings and coins and all kinds of things. So
Well, now on the back of this, it says this is for ages 24 to 37.
no, it doesn't.
No, it says
See, it says ages
for ages
7 to 12. Yeah, so it is
so
the
it's a
older
little bit
kids.
the older kids.
Yeah. So
I just don't want someone to say, "Hey, I'm going to get those for my 3-year-old."
Oh, yeah. I mean,
those kunkles, they don't know what they're talking about.
If you did get it for a younger kid, you would just read a page or two at a time. Okay, the next one for young kids, maybe 3 to 12 or something. That's a big span, but I think they work. Okay, so Voice of the Martyrs, who we mentioned before and we're going to mention again, they do videos for children called the Torchlighters, Heroes of the Faith. Now, we have the whole series, but we pulled out 3 of them to show you guys.
Now, let's just, when we want to be clear, okay, these are not like modern Pixar animation videos. Okay.
No,
so they're a little more the old school style. That's why I think if you start these younger, with your kids, they're good because what ends up happening and what we've seen with our kids is they get captured by the story and they pay less attention to that, which is not as important, the quality of the animation, but they really get captured by the story. So just want to, I guess, lay that out there as a caveat. Like if you get this and you think, oh, I'm going to show this to my middle schooler and they watch this for the first time, they're going to be like, that's cheesy. Okay. But start this one younger.
Yeah, these videos were done by a ministry, and so they're not Pixar $1 million budget animation.
But they tell great stories.
They do a really
Our
good
kids
job.
have been captured by these.
Yeah, telling the story. So Samuel Morris, Perpetua, William Booth, John Bunyan. I'm trying to think of all. Oh, Jim Elliot. There's so many Christians that they cover
Eric
in
Liddell
this series.
is one of them.
Oh yeah, Eric Liddell.
There's you said Perpetua.
Yeah.
I think there's about 12 in the series or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Corey Ten Boom's also in there as well. So these are great little videos. I think they're about 30 minutes, and it's wonderful to buy the whole series. You're supporting a great ministry, and your kids will enjoy them, and definitely it's a good introduction into who these people are.
Yeah, it looks like the website on the back of the videos is torchlighters.org. There's also another website, kidsofcourage.com.
So we can link to those all in the show notes, especially if you're listening to this driving or on a walk or running kids around. We will link all these things in the show notes so you can look it up later.
Okay, well, we still are on the young kids. I have here, it's called Theologian Trading Cards. Now, I know part of me is like, is that
cheesy?
Is that cheesy Christian, Jesus junk kind of stuff? Or we're just copying like baseball cards? And it is, the idea is. But this one is not, when you look at it, it's not cheesy. It actually has just a ton of Christians throughout history, going all the way back to the 1st century. I mean, going all the way back to like someone like Polycarp. And then more modern Christians of the Reformation. And so, I mean, right there, I'm just kind of flipping through these cards. And so you got Thomas Cranmer. And he's, it gives you some biographical information on the back of the card, gives a picture of him,
Hey, we just were in England and saw the site where Thomas Cranmer was burned at the stake by Bloody Mary.
That's right. And so it lays out some of the significance of his life. It says right there, Cranmer was burned at the stake in 1556. And so it gives some basic information about these saints. So this could be a fun way, particularly maybe with a boy who's collecting baseball cards, to have a set like this, but to just pull them out and to read through some of them and to get, connected with church history. And I remember just with baseball cards, I collected baseball cards when I was a kid, but that helped me memorize like the picture, what this person looked like, and then just some info about them. So that's a fun thing that Zondervan put out, is just another tool.
Well, the trading card thing does not appeal to me as a person, but
that's offensive.
It's reminding me that there are like some probably more boys than girls, but maybe girls too. Some boys would really be drawn to a box of cards and looking through them. Just like I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So you don't want to learn about Ambrose of Milan?
Not from a card. So, but I'm thinking about like, remember when Micah, our now 20-year-old, was 10 or 11, and we hadn't seen this Bible before, but it was all in.
Oh, the comic Bible. What was it?
It was called the Picture
Action
Bible.
No, it was the Action.
The new one's called the Action Bible, but the one Micah has is called the Picture Bible.
Oh.
But anyway,
It was
it was
like
all
comics.
done in comic strip form. And Micah loved comic strips. So we saw that. I mean, this was, again, many years ago. We got him that Bible, and he read it cover to cover. He loved it because it was in comic strip. Now, I would never read a Bible.
Well, our
like
daughters, like Paige,
Yeah, they had no.
Ella, have no interest.
No interest in that.
The comic book Bible.
So the trading card thing that just is reminding me, there are going to be different things that appeal to kids depending on things they like. So I'm glad you remembered to bring those
And
up.
look, I mean, it says a fun way to learn church history and theology. I mean, it says it on the box.
It's fun.
But nearly 300 cards cover major theologians, leaders, and even troublemakers.
Troublemakers.
Okay, that will get your boys
troublemakers.
interested. So
Making good
you got
trouble.
that.
Okay, so then we'll move maybe to a little bit older kids, and also anything we'll mention now is good things that I have enjoyed reading as an adult as well. So for older elementary, middle school, high school kids, students, I'll say it that way. Okay, the first one, a good book to have for the family is this book called Trial and Triumph. And it goes through, I just want to look at before you hold it up. Okay, so it starts with the early church, Polycarp, who you mentioned, who's year 69 AD.
Mentioned in the scriptures.
Yes, and goes through Middle Ages, the Reformation, modern missions, recent times. Okay, so it goes
Covers
over
broad swath.
a whole bunch of people. This book I've used many times over the years to read aloud stories of Christians in history. And each person they have about 3 or 4 pages about. So this is just kind of an overview one, but it's told in story form, and it's wonderful and captivating. And I have learned so much from church history just from reading this book. So Trial and Triumph.
That's Canon Press.
Is a good multi-person book that you could read to your family about. Okay, other book series that are good for especially kids reading on their own, older elementary. There's a Christian Heroes series that is published by YWAM, and we have found a few of these. And maybe I'll mention now, some of these books that I'm mentioning to you, I have found at used bookstores. So I am a big proponent of looking for resources on used bookstores, either locally or online at used bookstores. So I found the Hudson Taylor one and the C.S. Lewis one. I think I bought the C.S. Lewis one.
And there's more
price.
in this set.
And there's a whole group of them. So I'm just collecting them as we go along. But I recently just read the C.S. Lewis one myself, and I loved it. It was so good.
So that's Christian Heroes Then and Now.
Another book series, I have one about Susanna Wesley, who was the mother of Charles and Jonathan Wesley. This is another book series. And so all of these are biographies on these people, and they're good biographies. They captivate you. It's like reading a really good story.
Yeah, this one was published in 1976, so that's going to be a little older one.
Yeah.
It's going to be harder to find.
Here's some more of the Heroes in the Faith, older version. Wait, are these YWAM too? Hold on.
No,
one
these
second.
are Christian Heroes Then and Now. This series is a different series. This is the Heroes of the Faith series, and this is published by Barber.
Okay, so we will link to these also, but I have the Amy Carmichael, the Charles Spurgeon. I just pulled out a few that we had. Okay, another series, and again, these are all in story form. So here's one on Polycarp, who, as you said, is mentioned in the Bible, and they have ones on William Tyndale and Jim Elliot and all kinds of people. We have
This is Torchbearers.
This is Torchbearers, and Trailblazers is another one, and they're very similar in their style of writing. And we have one on George Whitefield.
Okay.
And then just in general, Christian biography. So if you or your kids have never read The Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom's book, this is an autobiography, but there are Christians who have written autobiographies that are so good. The Hiding Place is one of those where you not only learn about Christians in history, but you learn really good theology throughout, and is just so inspiring.
Yeah, just came to mind is in terms of a movie, the recent C.S. Lewis movie,
Yeah.
The Most Reluctant Convert. We just purchased that because we watched it, and then we want to watch it with the kids, and we've already taken the kids to the theater to see that. But that is a great, well done story of Lewis, and teaches you someone in church history. And if you'll notice, what's kind of the common theme through a lot of this, it's church history told through the stories of individuals. I notice these are, there's so many different biographies. They're biographies, they're personal stories. We don't say, hey, you know what you need to do? You need to start in, 45 AD and then trace a timeline and have your kids memorize all these different dates. And because that's how we often teach history in our history classes, and we kill it for our kids. Not that some of those dates aren't important, and not that some might have more interest in that, but one of the most compelling ways to teach history on any subject is to tell the stories of the people who lived it.
Yeah, the timelines come later. Figuring out, Polycarp was after Paul, who was after this. That will come later, but you want to capture your kids by the stories.
Yeah.
And a cool way, I was thinking of some ideas too, especially those of you with young kids, is you could get a world map and you could put it on the wall or on the fridge or somewhere. And as you start reading different stories, you could put pins on some of the people you're learning about and where they were in the world. And then the more people you're learning about, you're going to see how throughout history God has moved in every country, in every place, in every continent, I should say, in every place, and through all different people. Yeah. Or you could do a timeline. You could hang a string and print out pictures of the people you read about and start putting them in order and seeing things that God has done. So there's all kinds of ways through these stories you can start to help your kids to see what we were talking about in the beginning, that this is all a part of God's story, what he's doing, and we play a part of it, and we are just a part of it, and that he's been doing things long before us, and he'll continue to do things long after us.
Yeah, and I think we've laid out the reasons why, we've laid out the how. But this is such an important tool to remind us of Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, right? And this is when Peter confesses Jesus as Messiah. Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," in 16:16. And then Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, just pause there for a second. I think the misinterpretation there is thinking that Peter is the rock. It wasn't. Peter's not the rock. It's his confession that Jesus is the Christ, because Christ is the rock of the church, right? And so there's a difference in how the Catholics and Protestants interpret that. But then Jesus goes on to say this, "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And when we study church history, we teach ourselves and our kids that nothing will prevail against God's sovereign plan. And that alone is reason to teach your kids church history. Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.